Okay, let's talk about peer-to-peer networks. Well, the first actually functioning networks that we'll deal with, and the easiest one, cheapest one to set up, the hardest one to expand. So why is it called a peer? Well, if you look at the actual definition of a peer, what a peer is, you know, equal to one another. Yep, that about sums it up. All of these machines, right? Each one of these has the same authority on a peer-to-peer network, right? None is supervisory. None has more control than the other. They simply share the responsibility of connections, right? That means that, your physical layer is shared, but other than that, you don't share anything unless that particular host wants to share it. They all have equal claim to what is theirs, right? So that's why it's a peer, peer to peer. Nobody gets authority. Right? So we come to the concept of locus of control. Locus of control is a psychology term. Comes from the idea of what is under my control. If my locus of control is my parents, then they tell me what to do and I do it, right? So I don't have any responsibility, I don't have any consequence. I was just doing what I was told, right? Locus of control. So who controls the network? Well, the peer does. So if I want to share a file, right, I can only grab information from that file if my peer is sharing it, right? So we're talking about shared data as well as shared peripherals. So if I have a scanner hooked up to my machine and someone else on the peer-to-peer network wants to use it, I must share that resource, allow that resource to be shared, which means that I need to establish a local user for that purpose. Either that or give them my local password. Not a good idea, right? That's what peer-to-peer is. The locus of control stays at the local computer. So from that sense, from that perspective, nothing different than we've done so far. We're expanding out, allowing our machine to make other connections, but we're not giving up control of our machine. It still remains ours. So local user settings, local security policy, local group policy, all that stuff remains under our control. That's where the locus of control is, at the local machine. What are the pros for a peer-to-peer? Well, easy. It's quick and easy to establish, right? All you need is a switch or even just a crossover cable. So the peer-to-peer is simply a connection between two machines. If I have one PC, right, connected directly to another, for the most part, I need what's called a crossover cable. And we've looked at those before, at least briefly. That's where one is a T568A end, goes to a T568B end. That's what's known as a crossover cable. The transmit and receive cables are flipped. Right? So it's transmit on one side, goes to the receive pins on the other. That's what we need at minimum to do a peer-to-peer network. And that's simply two machines talking to one another. In the more complicated example, I'm going to get let me get rid of some of these. In a more complicated example, I'm going to introduce a switch. Boop. So now all my PCs connect via a switch. All right? It's still just a switch. So I'm sharing the physical layer, but now instead of a crossover cable, I just use a simple straight through. That should be an S. I simply use a simple straight through cable. So now my connections all through the switch, nothing else changes, right? Locus of control still remains. So it's easy to set those up. Buy a switch, buy a couple, or make a couple patch cables for 6 cents a foot. Boom, I have a peer-to-peer network, right? So in the triple constraint, the benefit comes with cost. It's easy. I already have a PC. I already bought the switch, right? Switches are, $15 for a 4-port switch. Nothing to it at all. Cost is really low. But If one of these triple constraints is easy, somewhere along the line, another one's going to take up that slack and be harder. So what's harder? Well, the cons are scalability. So the cost comes in time. How much time it takes me to set up those connections. With two machines, easy. I tell one where my files is, I tell the other where the files are, where the printer is. Simple. Go from one machine to the other, I'm set up. For every machine I add, it becomes that more complicated. 3 times more complicated, 4 times more complicated, 5 times more complicated. I tell each and every machine specifically where the resources are individually, and I have to grant each and every machine access to my devices, right? Access to my files. That could mean for a 15 peer network, I need 15 local users, right? Well, that's ridiculous, having to reproduce those users on every machine. Now, there are shortcuts to that, but then you give up security. If I create one user on every machine used to share files, I never know who accessed those files last. That's a problem, right? So scalability, the more I scale up, the less secure it is, or the more complicated the security becomes. That's the real con here, right? It's not scalable. So that's it in a nutshell, what a peer-to-peer network is. I will also give you this word. It's an ad hoc, what they call an ad hoc network, a network on the fly, right? So that's another term for peer-to-peer is ad hoc. Keep that in mind. So that's the difference there. There's the nuts and bolts of a peer-to-peer network, right? If you have any questions, you know where I am.